Hello everyone and welcome to another video. And for those of you who found yourself here after seeing my interview on the CBC's The National, after it actually airs, welcome to my channel. I'm making this video before my interview is scheduled to air on Monday, January 31st, 2022. I think it usually airs at nighttime in Canada. And the purpose of this video is to supplement that interview with additional context. I have no idea yet whether my interview will be cut out of context or even if it will still air for that matter. But even if it does air in its appropriate context, I specifically avoided too deeply debunking narratives on China in that interview for a couple of reasons. First, I was told that it was meant to be a report exploring social media influencers in China, and I wanted to avoid veering too far off topic. But second, after a couple of years of engaging with people who take Western media narratives on China at face value, I found that most aren't ready or receptive to hear anything that contradicts anything that has thus far been drilled into their minds. With that in mind, instead of telling you about my firsthand experiences and observations in China, or even Xinjiang specifically, and instead of going after specific claims, I'll do a couple of things here. First, I'll illustrate with a quick few examples how the media's coverage of China is dishonest, deliberately misleading, and has directly contributed towards a one-sided view of China, cultivating an unwillingness to even imagine taking someone seriously who contradicts those narratives. Second, I'll leave you with some critical questions which will hopefully get you thinking more about the logicality of those claims, particularly in regards to the Uyghur Genocide narrative. Hopefully, this will pique your interest enough to do the additional digging required to truly understand the situation. Because the truth is out there. We often celebrate this idea that we have more free speech and access to information than people in places like China. But what's the use if the accompanying systems in place have gotten so good at manipulating you into believing whatever it is they want you to believe? If you don't have the time or interest to dig deeper, hopefully some of the questions I ask you will at least get you to not take these narratives at face value and acknowledge how little you've been told about the real situation. After all, constantly believing stories that deflect your attention away from real issues that actually affect you at home, or from crimes that are perpetuated abroad by your own governments, or narratives meant to soften you up for the idea of whatever next conflict they're trying to sell you, has direct implications for you. With that in mind, moving into the content. As I mentioned in my CBC interview, which may or may not have been aired by now, I started vlogging to fill in the missing gaps in the mainstream media narrative. I'm unsure if that answer will be published in their final piece or not, but I referenced an article by the New York Times titled, "Who Influences the Influencers?" which basically tries to draw a connection between China-based vloggers and the Chinese government. This specific article is one of the articles that the CBC relied on when they were building this report, and they sent it over to me in our communications before our actual interview. One of the authors of that piece, Paul Moser, reached out to me, and I was actually meant to be included in that article. I used my answer as an opportunity to include facts and parts of the China story that had long been neglected by the New York Times. Paul's message was as follows. Hey Daniel, this is Paul Moser with the New York Times. Wanted to reach out because we are working on an article about some of the pro-China influencers and the support they get from state media/government. I wanted to make sure that you have a fair chance for comment. We don't mention your channel in the article, but we do have a clip in the story in which you say, "It's time to put Hong Kong first, and that entails cleaning up this rot. This is why Hong Kong's national security laws are being pushed through, and why it has so much support." Let me know if you have any comment on that particular quote, or more broadly about the topic. Cheers, Paul. So I replied to him and I said, "Sure thing, I'll expand on the rot comment. If the U.S. had been dealing with rioters throwing Molotov cocktails at police, knocking their teeth out, stabbing them in the necks, throwing acid at them, burning down shops, beating women in the streets, lighting people on fire, and killing people with bricks, all while Chinese Communist Party officials flew in from Beijing to meet with and praise these protesters. Plus, to top it off, you had an American protest leader flying over to Beijing to testify in front of the National People's Congress, asking for support and talking about containing America, but the U.S. had no national security laws or sufficient legal mechanisms to put a stop to this activity. I would also call this a rot and an issue that needed to be fixed. Well, that's exactly what happened in reverse with Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, Joshua Wong, and the rioters on the streets of Hong Kong. Hope this helps clarify my position. Thanks, Daniel. Now, if you'd like more context and evidence for some of the things I'm talking about in that reply, I'll put a link in the description to a video I made called A Reflection on American Foreign Policy, Arrogance, and Hypocrisy. Now, after I wrote this reply to Paul, I said to several of my friends that there's no way they could publish my answer without undermining what I believe was a considerable effort to hide certain details from their audience. They'd either need to severely take me out of context or completely drop me from their article. I already had a similar experience when Carrie Allen and Sophie Williams wanted to include me in a hit piece for the BBC. They totally dropped me after I pushed back on their narratives. Well, it turned out that I was correct. The New York Times decided to totally remove me from their article rather than publish facts that they've managed to long protect their audiences from. I, however, can further drive home the point about unbalanced narratives using this very article as an example beyond just dropping me. They included examples of allegations of forced Uyghur labor in Xinjiang, and they lobbed some allegations against Nike and some other companies. Another company they used to target was mysteriously missing from this article. Now, the New York Times has written about forced Uyghur allegations many times, but they used to include Skechers in their stories. However, Skechers did their own investigation into their supply chain, which included making unannounced visits to the factories implicated in the reports from outlets like ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. The New York Times obviously knows that this investigation and report exists, which is why they removed Skechers from the list of companies they talk about. They, however, never once wrote about that report. They simply excluded them from any further discussion, because suddenly they became extremely inconvenient to the narrative that they're very deliberately and dishonestly pushing. Even if they didn't believe Skechers, they could have at least acknowledged the existence of that report and said they had issues with it, if that indeed was the case, rather than quietly removing them from the narrative with no further engagement and without letting people know physical investigations were carried out on these unsubstantiated claims. I mean, how much more clear does it get that you're very deliberately and deceitfully not being given the full story and all of the facts? The CBC also did an entire episode on Xinjiang forced labor. They focused on tomatoes, and it suffered from all of the same issues of imbalance. They brought no third party on who disagrees with the allegations, and instead stacked the entire episode with people exclusively boosting these claims. They, of course, didn't mention Skechers either, and they had an opportunity to explore a counter-argument when Del Monte told them that they use Xinjiang tomatoes and there's no worker exploitation. But they decided to ignore this lead, not explore it any further, and move on to sources who were ready to supply responses that supported the allegations. Perhaps more troubling than that is that they uncritically included a testimony from a witness named Tersne Ziawadin, a supposed concentration camp survivor who escaped China legally through exit immigration on a passport that was renewed during the time she was supposedly under arrest. Now, when CNN aired her story, they conveniently blurred out her passport renewal date, oddly, presumably because this was a massive hole in her story. A story which, by the way, has changed many times, going back and forth between experiencing no abuse to very graphic tales of abuse. Her explanation as to why she was able to get a passport also changes from time to time, with the most recent from an interview with Arslan Hidayat, who described himself as a Uyghur extremist in a video where he wished that Allah would destroy the family of public servants in China. Now, in this interview, Tersne said that she was in a near-death state, and China wanted her to quickly leave the country so that she would die from her concentration camp injuries outside of the country to avoid being held accountable, even though presumably an autopsy would have been done and confirmed that she indeed experienced and died from brutal violence. I mean, does this sound logical to you? I actually reached out to CBC. I mean, this was so ridiculous that I reached out to CBC producers, the CBC producers of that piece. And it turns out that they knew her story had changed multiple times, and yet they didn't think this was an issue, nor did they inform their audience. They just hoped that the audience would take her testimony at face value and not learn about these contradictions. Does this sound like honest reporting to you? In my final attempt to illustrate how unbalanced the narrative is, I'd like you to pay attention to how mainstream media treats people who support the narratives on China versus those who contradict it. If you support the narrative, you'll be engaged with respectfully. Your motives won't be questioned. Your funding is a non-issue, and they'll want to actually meaningfully explore your ideas. On the contrary, when you challenge the mainstream media narrative, almost every single time you're contacted, it won't be to engage with you on your ideas. It'll be about trying to figure out if you're connected to the Chinese government, or if you're financially motivated to dare disagree with the Western narrative. I mean, this was the whole premise of my recent interview with the CBC just recently, exploring the morality of influencers promoting Beijing Olympics and the Beijing Olympics and the host city, while trying to find reasons why they shouldn't listen to us before actually really listening to us. They're trying to find a way to discredit us. And even when the suspected connections they're looking for don't exist. On the flip side, let's look at think tanks like ASPI, who put out China threat reports while being funded by the US State Department and weapons manufacturers, including Raytheon, who recently said in their fourth quarter earnings call that the tensions in the South China Sea is putting pressure on defense spending, which he suggests represents a future profit opportunity for the company and their investors. Across the board, mainstream media outlets, including the CBC, not only suddenly lose interest in stories about nefarious funding and motives, they'll actually welcome ASPI reports and analysts with open arms into their stories, use their reports, and never disclose to their audience this massive conflict of interest. The same people trying to convince you that China is an evil country that needs to be stood up to are the same people who will profit greatly once you believe China is an evil country that needs to be stood up to. What makes things even more remarkable is that ASPI has teamed up with social media companies like Twitter to help clean the platform up from fake or malicious narratives. Social media has already teamed up with government and military-connected organizations before who helped decide what was considered misinformation. They have a variety of solutions which include completely removing people off of their platforms, to shadow banning people, or finding creative ways to bury their content in organic-looking ways. I've got specific examples and videos about this, but that's a whole topic on its own. So just keep this in the back of your mind when you're trying to figure out why you only seem to only get one side of this story. But for now, let's get back on topic. So the U.S. State Department joining in on the ASPI fear-mongering funding party really shouldn't be too surprising either, considering they're in a virtual Cold War with China. And as much as America is a country governed by corporate interests and their lobbyists domestically, it's even worse when it comes to their foreign policy. The military has literally been deployed, democratically elected governments overthrown, or brutal sanctions declared on countries who didn't play ball with American corporate interests, repeatedly throughout history. If you'd like to learn more about this, I'll pop some recommendations into the description, but we'll limit the list and suggest that you find your own sources that you're comfortable with. Many of these operations can be verified by looking at declassified documents and operations directly on the U.S. government's own websites. If you're in doubt about any specific third-party sources that I provide, that would be a good place to go and cross-check some of them. A corporately driven foreign policy is also important to understand in the context of the U.S.'s stronghold on global South resource-rich countries that suddenly have a new viable economic partner that they can diversify onto. That may be great news for countries looking for new options to negotiate better terms with, but what it's not good for is U.S. corporate interests. So there are a few different things I've left you with to explore here, because it's of course very important to better understand some of the motives behind these narratives and campaigns against China, and what would the interest in discrediting China or discouraging countries from working with China, and what the possible benefits are of containing China. You know, it goes far beyond just a superficial title of being number one, or the idea of, remaining the largest economy in the world just for bragging rights. Moving on. The U.S. government also openly funds Uyghur separatist groups with millions and millions of dollars throughout various agencies like the NED, who also openly uses the separatists' flags directly on communications from U.S. government accounts. So, if media outlets are concerned that people who say positive things about China may have been corrupted by the Chinese government or funding, why isn't there equal concern that Uyghur activists saying negative things about China, especially Washington, D.C.-based ones like the one used in CBC's forced labor video, haven't also been corrupted and motivated by the millions of dollars being passed around in the overseas Uyghur community? To be clear, I don't think this is the only reason for Uyghur testimonies that frequently don't hold up to scrutiny. I do believe that some of them legitimately have detained relatives. you can be sure that some of the US government-funded separatist operations are reaching people on the ground in Xinjiang who may have been caught. Now, the legitimacy of the idea behind detaining separatists is a separate conversation, which would probably involve a lot of hypocrisy when looking at the history of places like, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, or even more recently, Catalonia. But that would be too long of a separate topic that could, granted and indeed, be legitimately debated. There could be other ideological reasons behind either lying or, once again, legitimately having family who have been detained in China. Those reasons are impossible to contemplate without having the full story. A part of that story has to do with the tens of thousands of Uyghurs who are in Syria fighting alongside al-Qaeda and whose children are training in ISIS-built terrorist camps. You can find this information on your own. It's difficult, but it is out there. But it's not being pushed to you. There's literal footage of this stuff, though. And this is an odd thing to not know about, while everyone is showing so much care and concern for the Uyghurs, don't you think? But in the context of having overseas Uyghurs who are involved in this kind of stuff, if there are tens of thousands in conflict zones with terrorists, don't you think it's entirely logical that China would have captured some of these al-Qaeda-affiliated people before they left or after returning? Some who have family remaining overseas, ready to spin it into a story of persecution when and if needed. Do you think perhaps the reason you're not being told about this dynamic is because it also creates incredible inconveniences to the mainstream narrative? Is there little concern for the violence they're carrying out in Syria because they're fighting against another geopolitical enemy of the West, Assad? I mean, we know that the U.S. has continually relied on terrorists to accomplish their geopolitical goals, ever since arming the Mujahideen to fight the Soviet Union, to deploying the kinds of terrorists who killed Gaddafi and overran Libya, to the leaked audio of John Kerry admitting that they were sitting back and watching ISIL advance on Assad. And this was after arming so-called moderate rebels, knowing these weapons were reaching terrorist groups. Taking a step back, how do you think this whole story would look if these Uyghurs who were heading out to Syria were instead carrying out jihad in the West? Do you think perhaps the most opportune story would suddenly have become about China not doing enough to stop terrorism and about them being an exporter of terrorism to the West? But since they're not doing that, and they could be a, valuable tool to U.S. geopolitical interests, is there even a chance that the U.S. might go as far as slowly ramping up support for these terrorist groups and paving a pathway for them to flourish on? Is this perhaps why in 2020 the U.S. delisted the al-Qaeda-affiliated ETIM Uyghur terrorist group off of the recognized terrorist list? Some people justify that by saying they haven't existed for a long time. Yet even if that was true, this isn't a valid reason. The Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka haven't existed for even longer, yet they haven't been removed. If China's claims of ETIM being a legitimate threat were always overblown, why did Major General Hecker of the U.S. military announce that they bombed a group of Uyghurs belonging to ETIM on February 7, 2018? Now, taking another step back, onto the so-called genocide. If there's a real genocide going on, why isn't there a massive refugee crisis? Why did the U.S. admit 0 Uyghur refugees in 2021? Why isn't the West proactively creating comprehensive Uyghur refugee programs if they really believed they were being genocided in China? Is it potentially because they know, aside from there being no real rush to leave, some of the Uyghurs who are operating between Turkey and Syria are indeed from a high-risk subgroup that they don't want to take in? Did they perhaps learn some important lessons from when the UK actively supported sending suspected jihadists over to Africa's most developed and richest country at the time, it's been turned into a disaster now, Libya, to fight against Gaddafi? And when it turned out that one of those very same people returned to the UK and began carrying out jihad at home and was the guy behind the Manchester bombing. I mean, there's a lot of things to think about here and precedents that have already been set. But taking another little bit of a sidestep here, I want to back away from the questions for a moment to clarify something really important. People don't like talking about these things directly, and I've gotten the sense that the Chinese media and Chinese government doesn't like to either, because you know that ultimately some bigoted people will begin to believe that Uyghurs are terrorists, full stop. China seems so concerned about this that they even banned Islamophobic content and comments online in 2017. On a side note, this seems like a counterproductive thing to do when you've got to convince your population to be complacent with genociding the Uyghurs, a thought I'll get back to in a moment. But back to my main point, this isn't about Uyghurs. This is about a specific subgroup of radicalized people who were, in fact, the biggest threat to ordinary, everyday Uyghur people as well, who were refusing to adopt their extreme interpretation of Islam. An interpretation that never existed in Xinjiang, and an interpretation that would have meant the real cultural genocide of the Uyghurs. I met, with the current imam of Idkha Mosque in Kashgar. His father was slaughtered by those terrorists, and he was the previous imam of that same mosque. And, of course, he was a Uyghur. Uyghurs have also had over 1,000 years of winemaking history, but one of my Uyghur friends was telling me how Uyghurs caught drinking by these extremists would be stabbed or have their ears cut off. So please remember, when I'm talking about Uyghur terrorists, they know in no way represent the Uyghur people or their culture. Finally, I want to bring attention to the last set of critical questions to wrap your mind around what you're expected to believe here. Some people have even gone as far as comparing what's happening in China to the Holocaust. Keep in mind, to breed the kind of complacency required to make what happened in Nazi Germany possible, there needed to be a massive demonization campaign against Jewish people. That's not happening in China. On the contrary, Uyghur culture is being celebrated on national stages, and China even wants it to be celebrated internationally. Now, this is a great opportunity to add a bonus example of the media maliciously omitting details with dishonest narratives and intentions. So, the BBC did a piece on Uyghur culture being preserved in the UK in the face of their culture at risk of eradication back home. One of the things they celebrated was that UNESCO recognized Uyghur dance as a cultural heritage of humanity by UNESCO. What they refused to tell their audience was who tirelessly worked to get it recognized by UNESCO to begin with. It was the Chinese government. They worked for years on it and expressed great frustration and disappointment when they hit roadblocks leading up to it. With an omission like this, one that would have massive implications for the direction BBC wanted to take this story in, they didn't even bother to just completely drop this from their story and pretend like they didn't even know about the UNESCO listing. They knowingly misappropriated it for their story while demonizing the very people responsible for that listing. It doesn't get much more ironic than that. But on to my main point. You're expected to believe that even in the absence of demonizing Uyghurs in China, in fact, even celebrating them, Han Chinese people in China, particularly in Xinjiang, who are watching their Uyghur brothers and sisters being genocided for the benefit of Han supremacy and their territory, are complacent with this genocide without first being propagandized into hating them, but while watching them be eradicated while singing and dancing alongside of them. Is this what you really want to believe? Is this logical to you? You must really need to believe that these Han Chinese people are extremely evil to think this. And that's where you can start to recognize when you can realize where the real Nazi propaganda is taking place. It's the propaganda against China, demonizing its people. Just like how the Nazis were saying that the Jewish people were murdering Christians, literally recycling Nazi propaganda, drawing Chinese people as insects, demonizing the foods they eat, just like Hitler did with kosher slaughtering practices. And you've got YouTubers with millions of subscribers comparing the Chinese government to the Nazis, while also putting out videos saying the majority of Chinese Americans, Canadians, and Australians are fiercely loyal to these Nazis. People then have the nerve to act confused as to why Asian hate crimes have been on the rise. As a matter of fact, even Rabia Kadir, a Uyghur who was the richest woman in China, now a U.S. government-connected activist, once said to an Italian journalist, "As you can see, we gesticulate in the same way, and you have the same white skin that I have. Like me, you are an Indo-European. Do you want a yellow-skinned communist to rule over you?" The truth is, of course, though, taking another step back, I keep taking these steps back, that there are, of course, issues that need to be fixed in China, and some of which I've spoken about before on my channel. But the narratives being pushed to you about what's happening in Xinjiang couldn't be any more disconnected from reality. On the contrary to demonizing the Uyghurs, China is rallying behind them. As the U.S. sanctions products made by Uyghurs to supposedly help them, ordinary Chinese people have made a special effort to show their support for the Xinjiang economy, their products, and industries. The excuse used to justify these sanctions is, of course, that the Uyghurs are forced to work. This has unfortunately resulted in some factories who rely on foreign markets to stop hiring Uyghurs or even to send Uyghurs home. Because even seeing a Uyghur in a factory has resulted in unfounded claims which people are so willing to take at face value. Take Darren Byler, for example, who had ripped down a video from a Uyghur Douyin user, which is the Chinese TikTok, cropped out the user ID so you couldn't go and find the original video in his original account, and said that because he was working on a Skechers factory line, it proved that there was forced labor issues. Darren has become a very important propagandist for this campaign, even participating in government panels, acted like he really wanted Skechers to go in and investigate. But when they did that, he never even acknowledged their investigation, engaged with it, or brought it to his audience's attention. By ignoring the very thing he pretended he wanted to see when it yielded results that contradicted his narrative, you know beyond a reasonable doubt that he is indeed a propagandist and not somebody honestly exploring this topic or issue. Unless everyone thinks that the only way a Uyghur would be working is if they were forced to, you have to concede how dishonest these conclusions are, and how concerning it is when we hear that some factories now refuse to hire Uyghurs. In regards to the specific forced labor claims, I'm going to leave a link to a paper that ripped through ASPI's forced labor report, which was used as material for so many mainstream media outlets. And I'll also share a couple of videos which summarize a few of the report's key points. I could keep going on for ages with various questions you should be asking yourself, but I hope I provided you with enough to prove that you haven't been getting the full story and that you're being outright lied to. If you're open-minded enough to accept this fact, from there, you'll be ready to engage honestly with the people who have concerns about this narrative or who are saying things that don't align with your pre-existing understanding of the situation. Many of you have been conditioned into becoming a very important part of this propaganda system that's consumed you, leading many people to just shout genocide denier the moment anybody even thinks about scratching their head over the illogicality of this narrative. And you're helping to preserve and police a system which discourages anyone from asking these questions or outright attacks anyone who doesn't believe in the narrative. And many there are. I know many academics and politicians who remain quiet out of necessity. This is creating a system that disincentivizes anyone from getting anywhere even close to seeing through these dishonest narratives. Now, in regards to my CBC interview, if I find that once it airs, it was cut too far out of context, or if they chose to just drop me like the New York Times did, or if I feel there would be benefit to publishing more context, I'll upload a copy of the full interview to my channel. This is an issue I believe everyone should care about more. If it's just from the perspective of really caring about the Uyghurs, the actions being taken, especially by the U.S. government, are driven by malicious intentions and hurt the very people they're pretending to care about in more ways than one. But that's a topic of its own as well, just like how it also is in regards to how these kinds of campaigns deflect your attention away from the real issues at home and massive human rights abuses happening overseas and other places with the help of the West and its allies, which you are actually supposed to have the power to stop. If human rights and making the world a less evil place is really your intention, your system does a really great job of getting you stuck in inefficient or illogical efforts, preventing you from realizing where you could make immediate and real change, because it would have too many implications for the very systems you're purposefully stuck in and unwittingly preserving even. Once again, that's a massive topic on its own, and I think I'll leave it pretty much here. I hope that you seek out additional opinions and perspectives and look at the facts from people, even other than me. You don't even need to come to the same conclusions that I have, but it's going to be pretty difficult to dispute that the conversation that's happening in mainstream media right now is indeed a very dishonest one. Do with that information what you will. I'll leave you with a couple of my own video recommendations that dig a bit deeper into these topics, including an interview I did on Breakthrough News about Hong Kong and Xinjiang, and also a video which was a direct kind of a debate/conversation that I had with one of the mainstream media journalists pushing these narratives against China. And I will also finish off this video by leaving you with a couple of bonus clips. One is from a documentary on the NED, National Endowment for Democracy. It is one of the main vehicles, one of the main U.S. government vehicles delivering millions of dollars to overseas Uyghur groups willing to campaign against China. And what you'll see in the clip I share is one of the Uyghur activists at the World Uyghur Congress, a group behind a group that's basically benefiting from that NED funding, and who is often used in media reports. What he does in this video, the guy being interviewed, is he reveals his source for the millions of Uyghurs in concentration camps allegation that you hear many times. Now, this is a number which, by the way, originally came about after extrapolating the claims of 8 Uyghurs across the entire massive Xinjiang region, extrapolating their statements across regions that didn't even suffer from terrorism as well. Anyway, in the clip, you will find out that although Western media gets some of its information from the World Uyghur Congress, the World Uyghur Congress claims they get their information from Western media in a bizarre, endless loop, apparently. I'll put a link in the description to the NED documentary so you get a better idea of what they're about, above and beyond even just the Xinjiang issue. Despite the D standing for democracy, you'll learn that the organization doesn't really have anything to do with promoting democracy. Now, the final clip I'll leave you with is an excerpt from the Uyghur Tribunal. The Uyghur Tribunal has no legal power and is not a government-recognized organization. It was set up by a private limited company called Uyghur Administration Limited and was funded by, you guessed it, NED-funded groups. Without any real legal power, the whole thing was basically just a performative show to influence public opinion, and it included performances like a witness coming out in chains. When he was asked where the chains came from, he said he bought them in Turkey. Anyway, this specific clip involves someone being questioned about showing only a few thousand detained people, and how to reconcile it with the claim of over 1 million in detention. It made for a bit of an awkward moment, because nobody there was meant to undermine any of the leading narratives. I mean, they even invited Arslan Hidayat, the guy who calls himself an extremist and separatist who wants Allah to destroy the family of public servants in China. The reason that this private limited company needed to be set up was because there isn't any actual quality admissible evidence for a real case against China. I mean, even when the U.S. State Department lawyers were pressed to weigh in, they concluded that there was insufficient evidence to say that a genocide was going on. If you spent enough time cutting through all of the junk, you'd understand why any self-respecting lawyer who still wants to be taken seriously after this whole thing is exposed for the giant propaganda campaign that it is, really can't and shouldn't be denying this fact. What's perhaps an interesting piece of irony as well is that many of these U.S.-funded groups involved in the Uyghur Tribunal actually even tried to push the U.S. criminal court to bring a case against China. And the ICC said that they needed more evidence to bring a case against China. But the ironic part comes in is that the ICC, however, did have enough evidence to open investigations on U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan. But ICC court members and even their family members were sanctioned by the U.S. after even thinking about doing such a thing. This shouldn't be too much of a surprise to anyone familiar with what's going on with Julian Assange, but nonetheless, it's a helpful perspective when you start to begin really asking questions about what is this all really about? Anyways, I think I've been rambling on for long enough. I think I'm going to end it here. I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for joining, and I will see you next time. Peace.
At the ceremony, I met Omer Kanat, chairman of the World Uyghur Congress, a group funded almost entirely by the NED.
The Chinese authorities, Chinese government put more than 1 million Uyghurs in so-called re-education camp. It is very similar to a concentration camp.
How do you know it's 1 million, the number? That's a very staggering number.
Yeah, staggering number. This number was given to by some Western media estimates. We don't know exactly how.
Western media estimates.
And some of other states 2 to 3 million. Is there any way of? I mean, how do we check which is correct?
We refer to different references, and the data that we have, it's just based on what we have. Could you please repeat your question?
Really, I was trying to get the veracity of what numbers of people have actually been interned or been to these camps.
Okay, as you said, it's 5,567 in total. We don't have this entire millions of references. It's not that everyone can come to us and report the data.
Bye.